Nobody believed it when they saw the children. A man of 5 feet 3 inches, a woman of 6 feet 11 inches, and children who grew so tall, so impossibly strong, that plantation owners traveled from 3 states away just to witness them with their own eyes. But that's not the shocking part. The shocking part is what those children did when they finally understood what they were. When they realized that the same genes that made them valuable also made them unstoppable. When they discovered the secret their mother had been whispering to them every night since birth. A secret about power, about destiny, about what happens when you forge weapons and give them consciousness. What happened on the night of March 15, 1865, would be whispered about in plantation houses across Georgia for generations. Would make hardened overseers refuse to work at Riverside Plantation ever again. Would become the cautionary tale that masters told each other about the fatal mistake of creating something stronger than you can control. This is that story, and it begins not with violence, but with a song sung by the river on a September evening 12 years earlier. September 1853, the meeting. Samuel was singing the first time she heard him. His voice was soft, barely audible over the sound of the Savannah River flowing past, carrying water south toward the Atlantic Ocean 40 miles away. It was a song his mother taught him before she died of fever 7 years ago. Something about crossing water, about stars pointing north, about a promised land that existed somewhere beyond the cotton fields and the whips and the endless, crushing sameness of enslaved life. He was 27 years old that September evening. 5 feet 3 inches tall, weighed maybe 115 pounds after a good meal, which he rarely got. Born on the Riverside Plantation in McIntosh County, Georgia, about 60 miles south of Savannah, on land that stretched along the river like a wound that never healed. Never knew his father, sold to Alabama before Samuel drew his first breath. Had picked cotton every single day since he was old enough to drag a sack behind him through the rows that stretched to the horizon. He was invisible, the kind of slave that overseers barely noticed. Too small to be threatening, too weak to be particularly valuable, too quiet to cause trouble. He simply existed, worked his assigned rows from dawn until his hands bled, kept his head down when overseers passed, survived one day at a time because that's all you could do when you were property. But on this September evening in 1853, sitting by the river during the brief stolen window between the end of work and the beginning of sleep, Samuel allowed himself something dangerous. He allowed himself to remember that he was human, that he had feelings deeper than exhaustion, thoughts beyond tomorrow's labor, a soul that hadn't been completely crushed by 27 years of bondage. The river was his sanctuary, the only place on the entire plantation where he felt something close to peace. The sound of the water reminded him that there was a world beyond cotton and chains, that rivers flowed to oceans, that oceans connected to distant lands, that somewhere, impossibly far away but still existing, people lived free. He was singing when he heard the sound. Footsteps, heavy ones, coming through the trees along the riverbank. Samuel's song died in his throat instantly. His body went rigid with fear. Slaves weren't supposed to be by the river alone after dark. If an overseer caught him here, that was 20 lashes minimum, maybe more if they were in a bad mood. But the figure that emerged from the darkening trees wasn't an overseer. It was the new woman, the one Master Richardson had bought at the auction house on Bryan Street in Savannah 3 days ago, the one everyone called the Giant, or that African demon woman. Samuel had seen her from a distance when she arrived at the plantation. Seen her chained in the back of Richardson's wagon like a wild animal, 4 armed overseers surrounding her with rifles at the ready. Seen the way she had to bend her neck to avoid hitting the wagon's canvas cover. Seen the mixture of rage and terror in her eyes as she was paraded past the assembled slaves. But he hadn't seen her up close until now. She was enormous, easily 6 feet 11 inches tall, maybe even 7 feet if she stood fully straight instead of the defensive hunch she carried. Her shoulders were broader than any man Samuel had ever seen. Her arms were thick with muscle that rippled under her dark skin. Her hands looked like they could crush skulls without effort. Even in the dim twilight, she was terrifying. Samuel's first instinct was to run. Every survival instinct screamed at him to bolt back toward the quarters. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she was moving, slow, cautious, like a wounded animal. Maybe it was the way her eyes swept the area, not with aggression but with fear. Maybe it was something in her face that reminded him of his mother before the fever took her. That look of someone trapped with no way out. She saw him. Their eyes met across 15 feet of riverbank. Samuel's heart hammered. He was small, defenseless. She could kill him with one hand. But she didn't move toward him. Just stood there, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Samuel did something stupid. Something that would change both their lives forever. He started singing again, the same song, soft, gentle, non-threatening. He didn't know if this woman understood English. The overseers had been complaining loudly that she spoke only African gibberish. Didn't know if she understood anything except violence and chains. But music was universal. And in his voice was something she hadn't heard since being captured. Something human. Something kind. Abini, though Samuel didn't know her name yet, stood perfectly still. This tiny man singing to her like she was a person worth singing to. It made no sense. In the 5 years since she'd been stolen from her homeland in the mountains of Abyssinia, no one had approached her with anything except fear or cruelty. They beat her, chained her, worked her like an animal, called her monster. But this small man was singing. To her. For her. Something in her chest, something that had been frozen solid since the slave ship crossed the ocean, cracked slightly. Let in the first sliver of light she'd seen in 5 years. She sat down, right there on the riverbank, slowly, carefully, showing she wasn't a threat despite everything about her that screamed danger. Samuel kept singing. His voice shook slightly now. He was still terrified, but he kept going. Finished the song, started another. Old spirituals his mother taught him. Songs that enslaved people had been singing for generations. They sat there for 20 minutes. Him singing, her listening. 2 people who should have been terrified of each other, instead sharing a moment of fragile humanity. When Samuel finally stopped singing, he pointed to himself. Samuel, then pointed to her with a questioning look. She understood, pointed to herself. Abini. Samuel nodded, tried to repeat it. Failed. She almost smiled. Then she stood. Samuel's heart jumped. But she didn't come closer, just looked at him for a long moment. Then walked back into the trees. Samuel sat there for another hour. Something important had shifted, something that felt dangerously like hope. But he hadn't seen her up close until now. She was enormous. Easily 6 feet 11 inches tall, maybe even 7 feet if she stood fully straight instead of the defensive hunch she carried. Her shoulders were broader than any man Samuel had ever seen. Her arms were thick with muscle that rippled under her dark skin. Her hands looked like they could crush skulls without effort. Even in the dim twilight, she was terrifying. Samuel's first instinct was to run. Every survival instinct screamed at him to bolt back toward the quarters. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she was moving, slow, cautious, like a wounded animal. Maybe it was the way her eyes swept the area, not with aggression but with fear. Maybe it was something in her face that reminded him of his mother before the fever took her. That look of someone trapped with no way out. She saw him. Their eyes met across 15 feet of riverbank. Samuel's heart hammered. He was small, defenseless. She could kill him with one hand, but she didn't move toward him, just stood there, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Samuel did something stupid, something that would change both their lives forever. Before we continue, don't forget to comment which city you're watching from, and if you're not subscribed yet, make sure to hit that button so you don't miss the next stories. Let's keep going. He started singing again, the same song, soft, gentle, non-threatening. He didn't know if this woman understood English. The overseers had been complaining loudly that she spoke only African gibberish, didn't know if she understood anything except violence and chains. But music was universal, and in his voice was something she hadn't heard since being captured, something human, something kind. Abini, though Samuel didn't know her name yet, stood perfectly still, this tiny man singing to her like she was a person worth singing to. It made no sense. In the 5 years since she'd been stolen from her homeland in the mountains of Abyssinia, no one had approached her with anything except fear or cruelty. They beat her, chained her, worked her like an animal, called her monster. But this small man was singing, to her, for her. Something in her chest, something that had been frozen solid since the slave ship crossed the ocean, cracked slightly, let in the first sliver of light she'd seen in 5 years. She sat down, right there on the riverbank, slowly, carefully, showing she wasn't a threat despite everything about her that screamed danger. Samuel kept singing. His voice shook slightly now. He was still terrified. But he kept going. Finished the song, started another. Old spirituals his mother taught him. Songs that enslaved people had been singing for generations. They sat there for 20 minutes. Him singing, her listening. 2 people who should have been terrified of each other instead sharing a moment of fragile humanity. When Samuel finally stopped singing, he pointed to himself. Samuel. Then pointed to her with a questioning look. She understood. Pointed to herself. Abini. Samuel nodded, tried to repeat it. Failed. She almost smiled. Then she stood. Samuel's heart jumped, but she didn't come closer, just looked at him for a long moment. Then walked back into the trees. Samuel sat there for another hour. Something important had shifted. Something that felt dangerously like hope. The courtship. Every night for 2 weeks, Samuel went to the river. And every night, Abini was there waiting. Neither acknowledged it openly during the day. That would be too dangerous. But they established a routine, a silent agreement. At first they didn't talk. Samuel would sing. She would listen. After a week, Samuel started teaching her English, pointing at things. Tree, river, sky, moon, star. She repeated the words in her deep voice, her accent heavy but her learning quick. She taught him words from her language too. Beautiful, complex words he could barely pronounce. She laughed when he failed. Gradually, they began to actually communicate. Samuel told her about the plantation, about Master Richardson and the overseers, about how to survive, how to become invisible. Abini told him about her home, about mountains so high that clouds lived between the peaks, about her people who grew tall and strong, about freedom she'd once known, actual, lived freedom, about the void in her chest where her old life used to be. And slowly, something grew between them, something neither expected, something dangerous. They fell in love. Not sudden, dramatic love, the slow kind. Built on conversations and shared humanity, on seeing each other when the world wanted them invisible. When Samuel first touched her hand, his small palm against her massive one, it felt like completing a circuit. When Abini first kissed him, leaning down from her extraordinary height, it felt like reclaiming stolen choice. The other slaves noticed, whispered, the tiny man and the giant woman. It seemed impossible. But the way they looked at each other couldn't be denied. Old Martha, who'd been on the plantation for 43 years, pulled Samuel aside, told him to be careful, that love between slaves was dangerous, that masters could use it against you, that opening your heart was just giving them another weapon. Samuel knew she was right. Knew loving Abini was dangerous. But he also knew that life without love wasn't really living. He'd rather have her for however long they had, even if only days, than spend the rest of his life empty. When they jumped the broom in December 1853, the slave marriage ceremony, it was small. 10 witnesses. A borrowed broom Samuel had carved from oak branches. Old Martha said a few words about commitment and endurance and hope. Then together, hands joined, they jumped over that broom. The symbolic crossing from individual to union, from alone to together, from one to family. Master Richardson heard about it the next day and laughed. Let them marry. Why not? Married slaves meant babies. And if that giant woman had children who inherited her size, that would be valuable. Very valuable. He approved with a wave of his hand, even gave them a spare cabin, one taller than the others, a wedding gift. Really just investment in future property. He had no idea what he was actually allowing to happen. The children Abini became pregnant in the spring of 1854, about 4 months after their marriage. Her belly grew enormous, far larger than seemed normal for any pregnancy, swelling until she looked like she was carrying twins or triplets. The slave women who'd served as midwives for years had never seen anything like it. They whispered among themselves that a woman that size carrying a baby that large would never survive childbirth. That something unnatural was happening. Samuel was terrified in a way he'd never been before. There were no doctors for slaves. Medical care was reserved for valuable property like horses, not for human property that could be replaced cheaply at auction. Just the midwives with their folk knowledge passed down through generations, their herbs gathered from the woods, their experience that had clear limits. And none of them had ever delivered a baby from a woman nearly 7 feet tall. Labor started on a sweltering July night in 1854. The kind of Georgia summer night where the heat doesn't break even after sunset, where the air is so thick you can barely breathe. Abini's water broke while she was lying on their cabin floor. There was no bed that could support her size, so they slept on pallets on the dirt floor like most slaves. Samuel ran for the midwives, his heart pounding, hands shaking with fear. Old Martha came immediately, bringing 2 other women experienced with difficult births. They assessed Abini quickly, felt her belly, checked her progress, and exchanged looks that terrified Samuel. The labor lasted 18 hours. 18 hours of Abini screaming in her native language, words Samuel didn't understand, but whose meaning was universal. Pain, fear, determination, rage. The midwives did what they could with cloths soaked in river water, with teas made from willow bark, with prayers whispered to God and older spirits whose names they didn't say aloud. Samuel stayed by her side the entire time, held her hand, her massive hand that could crush his, while she squeezed hard enough to leave bruises. Whispered to her in English and the few words of her language he'd learned. Told her she was strong, told her the baby was almost here, told her he loved her. Over and over. I love you. I love you. I love you. Like a prayer. Finally, as dawn broke and birds started singing, the baby came. One final scream from Abini that echoed across the plantation. One final push. Then crying. A baby's cry. High and strong and alive, and the most beautiful sound Samuel had ever heard. A girl. Old Martha lifted the baby and cleaned her quickly, wrapped her in a thin blanket they'd saved for this moment. Turned to Samuel with an expression between relief and confusion. The baby was perfectly normal. Completely, totally normal. 19 inches long, 7.5 pounds. Crying and healthy and pink like every newborn. Everyone was shocked. The witnesses gathered outside had expected a giant baby. A monstrous thing that would explain Abini's enormous belly, but this was just a baby, tiny, wrinkled, perfect, ordinary. Samuel held his daughter for the first time and cried. Not from disappointment, he didn't care what size she was, from relief that overwhelmed everything, from joy that felt almost painful, from the realization that he was a father. That despite being property with no legal rights to this child who could be sold away at any moment, he had helped create life, had brought something beautiful into this ugly world. Abini held their daughter next and cried too, silent tears cutting tracks through sweat and exhaustion. She'd been terrified the pregnancy would kill her, terrified the baby would be taken immediately, terrified of bringing a child into slavery. But here she was, alive. Her daughter alive. Her husband beside her. For this one perfect moment, they were a family. They named her Grace, because grace was the only word that fit, an undeserved gift in a world that gave them nothing. Master Richardson came to see the baby the next day, walked into the cabin without knocking. Slaves had no privacy. Looked down at the infant with obvious disappointment. He'd been hoping for a giant infant, a super-strong baby who'd grow into a super-strong worker. But this was just a normal child, small even, barely worth the food it would cost to raise her. He left without comment, already dismissing Grace as unimportant. He had no idea he was wrong. Grace grew normally for the first 2 years, hit all the expected milestones at expected times, rolled over at 4 months, sat up at 6, walked at 13 months while holding Samuel's fingers, talked at 18 months, first word was "Papa," which made Samuel cry again. Was a cheerful, healthy toddler who played with other slave children in the brief hours between their small chores. Even children as young as 3 or 4 were given simple tasks like gathering eggs or pulling weeds. Samuel and Abini watched their daughter with love and terror. Love because she was theirs. Terror because they knew she could be sold at any moment. Because they knew she was growing up in chains. Because they knew the life ahead of her would be brutality and soul-crushing labor. But they also watched her with hope, because she was proof that love could exist even here, that beauty could grow in poisoned soil. Then something changed. Grace turned 3 years old in July 1857. A month later, she had a growth spurt. Not unusual, children often grew in spurts. But this was different. Grace shot up 4 inches in 6 weeks. Suddenly she was noticeably taller than other children her age. Her appetite increased dramatically. She was always hungry, eating portions that seemed too large for her body. By her 4th birthday in 1858, Grace was the height of a typical 7-year-old, 48 inches tall when most 4-year-olds were around 38 inches. Tall for her age, certainly, but not alarmingly so yet. People noticed, commented, said she was growing like her mother, but it wasn't cause for concern yet. At age 5 in 1859, Grace was the size of a 9-year-old. 54 inches tall, 4.5 feet, when she should have been around 42 inches. Taller than every child her age by more than a foot. Strong enough to carry water buckets that made other children struggle. The pattern was becoming clear. This wasn't normal growth. This was something extraordinary. Samuel and Abini watched with growing amazement and growing fear. Their daughter was different. Visibly, obviously different. And different was dangerous on a plantation where conformity meant survival. By age 6 in 1860, Grace looked 12. She stood 4 feet 10 inches tall, nearly 5 feet. Other slave children were afraid of her now, not because she was mean. Grace was gentle and careful with her growing strength, but because she was different, wrong somehow, unnatural. Samuel and Abini had difficult conversations with her, had to explain that she needed to be careful, needed to hide her strength, needed to pretend to be weaker than she was when overseers watched, needed to make herself small even though she was growing large. These were survival skills taught to a 6-year-old, lessons no child should need to learn. At 7 in 1861, Grace looked 14. At 8 in 1862, she stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, taller than most grown women, taller than many men, taller at 8 than her father would ever be, and was regularly mistaken for an adult slave by overseers who didn't know her. The pattern was unmistakable. She wasn't just growing normally, she was growing explosively, adding inches at an impossible rate, like something in her genetics had been dormant for her first years, then suddenly activated. Like she'd inherited Abini's extraordinary genes, but they'd come online slowly, building over time instead of being present from birth. And Grace wasn't alone. Abini gave birth to twin boys in February 1856, when Grace was 18 months old. Samuel and Abini named them Joshua and Daniel, after biblical figures who'd shown courage against impossible odds. They were born normal-sized, 6 pounds each, perfectly ordinary, stayed small and ordinary looking for the first 2 years. Then at age 3 in 1859, they started growing too. The same pattern as Grace, the same explosive growth that added inches at an impossible rate. By age 5, both boys were the size of 8-year-olds. By 7, they looked like young teenagers. By age 9 in 1865, Joshua stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, and Daniel was 5 feet 9 inches. Both were stronger than grown men despite being children. Both were still growing. 2 years after the twins came another boy, Thomas, born in August 1858 while the country was tearing itself apart over questions of slavery's expansion. Same pattern as his siblings, normal birth, 7 pounds and 19 inches. Normal early childhood, then explosive growth starting around age 3. By 1865, at age 7, Thomas was already 5 feet 4 inches tall. Taller than most adult women, still a child in face and voice, but in a body that kept growing like it didn't know when to stop. Master Richardson watched this development with growing fascination bordering on obsession. These children were becoming exactly what he'd dreamed of. Giants, superworkers, proof he was smarter than other plantation owners. Other planters started visiting Riverside specifically to see Richardson's giant slaves. Came from as far away as South Carolina and Alabama. Brought their own overseers to witness. Offered enormous sums to buy the children, especially the boys. Wanted to breed them with their own slaves, wanted to study them. Wanted to own these extraordinary specimens. Richardson refused all offers. These were his property, his investment, his proof that he understood slave breeding better than anyone else. But something else was happening that Richardson didn't see. Something Samuel and Abini were carefully cultivating in their children. Something that would prove far more dangerous than mere size and strength. They were teaching their children to think, to question, to remember they were human. The education. Every night after the children were supposed to be asleep, Abini would gather them close in their cramped cabin. The space was tight now. Grace was 11 and nearly 6 feet 5 inches. The twins were 9 and approaching 6 feet. Thomas was 7 and over 5 feet. They barely fit. Abini would speak to them in her native language, the language Samuel still couldn't fully master, but which the children learned as easily as English. She told them stories about her homeland, about mountains that touched the sky, about her people who were never property, who walked free under the sun, who answered to no masters. She taught them about their heritage, explained why they were growing so tall. It wasn't just genetics, she said. It was destiny. Her people believed that height was a gift from the ancestors, that those who grew tall had a sacred responsibility. To protect those who couldn't protect themselves, to stand against injustice, to never bow, to never submit, to never accept that chains were natural or deserved. Before we continue, if you've made it this far in the story, comment freedom so I know who you are. Let's keep going. She taught them the old stories of her people, about warriors who fought tyrants and won against impossible odds, about resistance against slavers, about the belief that death as a free person was infinitely better than life in chains. These weren't just stories for entertainment. They were lessons, instructions disguised as bedtime tales, preparation for what might come. Samuel taught them different but equally important lessons about survival in a world that wanted them dead or broken, about strategy and patience, about how to appear smaller than they were, increasingly difficult as they grew taller, how to hide their growing strength from overseers, how to be underestimated, how to seem simple and docile when you were actually intelligent and aware. He taught them the slaves' survival skills, how to read white people's moods and intentions, how to predict violence before it arrived, how to avoid being selected for the worst punishments. But most importantly, he taught them to think strategically, to see patterns, to understand that strength without intelligence was just another form of slavery, that muscles could be chained but minds could not, unless you let them. Together, Samuel and Abini taught their children something revolutionary, that being enslaved didn't mean being property, that no matter what the law said, no matter what Master Richardson claimed, they were human beings. They had worth that wasn't measured in labor or profit. They had rights, natural rights, human rights, even if those rights weren't recognized by society. And someday, somehow, they would be free. The children absorbed these lessons completely. Grace became their natural leader. By age 11 in 1865, she stood 6 feet 5 inches tall. Smart beyond her years, strategic. She learned to hide her strength perfectly, to appear weak and docile in front of overseers, while secretly being capable of incredible feats. She could lift a full barrel of water by herself at age 10, 200 pounds lifted like it was nothing, but pretended to struggle with half-full buckets when overseers watched. The twins became protectors. They practiced fighting in secret, wrestling each other in the woods at night, boxing in the dark. By age 9, both could overpower grown men easily. By age 10, they were probably the strongest people on the entire plantation. But they never showed it in front of whites. They appeared to be just large, somewhat slow boys, gentle, docile, useful, but not threatening. Thomas became the thinker. Samuel taught him to read, a crime punishable by severe whipping. They used a Bible stolen from the big house. Thomas devoured every word, then found more. Newspapers that overseers left lying around, documents he glimpsed on errands. By age 7, he understood more about the world beyond Riverside than most adults. Understood about the war raging, about Union and Confederacy, about slavery tearing the nation apart. He understood that timing would matter, that soon, maybe very soon, there would be a moment to act, that the chaos of war created opportunities, that Richardson's world was crumbling whether he admitted it or not. By March 1865, everything was ready. The family was strong. The children were nearly grown. The war was ending with the Confederacy collapsing. The moment they'd been preparing for was arriving. They just needed the spark, the catalyst, the reason to act now rather than waiting. Grace provided it when she picked up a boulder and held it over Overseer Carver's head. March 1865. The crisis. Grace was working in the West Field when Overseer Carver decided to test her strength. It was a cold March morning, and Carver was drunk by 10 o'clock, his flask of cheap whiskey always within reach. He'd been watching Grace work all morning, irritated by how easily she made it look. This girl, barely 12 by his reckoning, though she was actually 11, was picking cotton faster than grown men. It annoyed him, made him want to prove she wasn't special. So he started making her lift increasingly heavy objects. Told her to carry a full cotton bale, normally a 2-man job. She did it without complaint, showing nothing beyond normal strain. He made her lift a log that had fallen near the field. She lifted it. He pointed to a cart wheel. She carried it. But Carver wanted more. Wanted to see her fail. Wanted to prove she wasn't as special as Richardson claimed. He pointed to a boulder at the edge of the field. A piece of granite that had been sitting there for generations because it was too big to move. Easily 300 pounds of solid stone. "Lift that," he ordered, his words slurred. Grace looked at the boulder, looked at Carver, said quietly, "I can't, sir. Too heavy." Carver's face flushed red. "I said lift it, girl." "I can't, sir," Grace repeated, keeping her eyes down. "Not strong enough." The whip came down across her shoulders without warning, cut through her thin dress and drew blood. Grace flinched but didn't cry out. Carver hit her again. "Try harder." Grace moved to the boulder, put her hands on it, made a show of straining, of trying her hardest, of attempting to lift something supposedly beyond her capabilities. Carver hit her a third time. The whip cut deep. Blood ran down her back. Something in Grace's eyes changed. Samuel, working 30 yards away, saw it happen, recognized it immediately. The same look Abini had before she attacked. The look of someone who'd been pushed past their limit, who'd made a decision that couldn't be unmade. Grace stood up, straightened to her full 6 feet 6 inches, looked down at Carver, who was 5 feet 9 and drunk, and suddenly aware he might have made a terrible mistake. Then Grace picked up the boulder, not with effort, not with strain, easily, like it weighed nothing at all, lifted it above her head with both hands, held it there while Carver stared up at her in sudden, terrible understanding. She could kill him, right now. Just drop the boulder, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. For 5 seconds, Grace held that boulder above Carver's head, long enough for him to understand what powerlessness felt like. Long enough for his drunk brain to sober up and realize he was about to die. Long enough to feel what every slave felt every day, complete vulnerability to someone else's whim. Long enough for him to piss himself, warm urine running down his leg. Then Grace set the boulder down gently, carefully, like placing a baby in a crib, turned her back on Carver, walked back to her cotton row, picked up her sack and went back to work like nothing had happened. Carver actually ran back toward the big house, stumbling in his haste, still wet from pissing himself. The other slaves in the field had stopped working to watch. They'd seen what Grace did, seen her strength, seen her mercy, seen the choice she'd made not to kill him, even though she could have. Samuel's heart was pounding. This was it. This was the moment he'd been dreading for years. Grace had revealed herself. There would be consequences. Severe consequences. Carver burst into Richardson's study, told him what happened, words tumbling over each other in panic. How Grace had lifted a boulder that should have been impossible. How she'd held it over his head. How close he'd come to being killed. How that giant slave girl was dangerous, was a threat, had to be dealt with immediately. Richardson listened with growing fury, his face turned red, then purple. No slave threatened an overseer. This required punishment. Severe, public punishment to re-establish order. He ordered Grace whipped, 50 lashes, public, tomorrow morning, in front of all the slaves, a lesson about what happened when you showed defiance. That night, Samuel and Abini held an emergency meeting in their cabin. Grace, the twins, Thomas, and 6 trusted adult slaves crowded into the space. Everyone knew what 50 lashes meant. It was a death sentence. No child could survive that. Even Grace, with her size and strength, couldn't survive having her back flayed open by 50 strokes. They couldn't let it happen. But stopping it meant open rebellion, meant fighting back, meant violence against whites, meant almost certain death for everyone involved. The plantation had 8 overseers, all armed. Richardson kept multiple weapons in the big house. In a straight fight, even giant slaves couldn't win against guns. But they couldn't just let Grace die either. Couldn't stand by and watch while Richardson murdered her for the crime of being strong. Samuel looked around the cramped cabin at the faces he loved most in the world. at his daughter who'd grown so tall and powerful, who sat with blood still seeping through her dress from Carver's whipping, at his twin sons who were 9 years old and already capable of incredible violence if unleashed, at Thomas who was 7 and smarter than most adults, at Abini who'd never stopped being a warrior even after 11 years in chains, at the 6 other slaves who'd risked everything just by attending this meeting. And he realized something profound. They'd been preparing for this moment for 11 years. Every lesson, every story, every whispered conversation about freedom and dignity. It had all been leading here, to this moment, this choice. They couldn't wait any longer, couldn't keep hiding and hoping. The moment had arrived whether they were ready or not. Samuel spoke quietly to the assembled group, told them what he was thinking. It was insane, probably suicidal, but possible. Maybe. The plan was simple. Don't wait for the whipping tomorrow. Strike first, tonight. While they still had surprise, fire was the key. Start fires in 4 locations simultaneously: the cotton storage, the barn, the overseer quarters, the big house. Create chaos. In the confusion, overpower any armed men, take their weapons, fight whoever was left, then run. Head north toward Union lines. Sherman's army was less than 100 miles away. If they could reach it, they'd be free. They'd probably die trying. But dying free was better than living in chains, better than watching Grace be whipped to death tomorrow. Grace spoke first. Said she'd rather die fighting tonight than be whipped tomorrow. She was 11 years old and deadly serious. Joshua and Daniel agreed immediately. They'd been waiting for permission to use their strength. They were ready. Thomas was scared, but also determined. He'd read about slave rebellions. Maybe this time would be different. The 6 adult slaves agreed. They'd rather die fighting than live subjugated. Abini spoke last. Said her people had a saying, "It is better to die on your feet than live on your knees." Tonight, they would stand. They made final plans. Who would start which fire? Who would target which overseer? Where to meet after? What route north? Midnight, new moon, maximum darkness. At midnight exactly, Grace struck the first match. The rebellion. The cotton storage went up like oil-soaked wood, flames shooting 15 feet high within seconds. Months of picked cotton, thousands of dollars worth, turning to ash and smoke. Grace watched for 3 heartbeats. This was Richardson's wealth, his pride, his proof that slavery was profitable. Burning. Then she ran toward the overseer quarters, where her brothers were already moving. Joshua hit the door with his shoulder. The wood splintered like kindling. He and Daniel burst inside before the 3 overseers barely had time to wake. One reached for a rifle hanging on the wall. Daniel grabbed him, picked him up like a child and threw him through the window. Glass shattered. The man's scream cut off when he hit the ground outside with a sickening thud. The second overseer pulled a pistol from his nightstand, got 1 shot off that punched through the wall. Joshua grabbed the man by the throat with one massive hand and squeezed until something gave way with a wet crunch. The man's eyes went wide, then empty. He dropped. The third overseer was Carver. The drunk bastard who'd whipped Grace, who'd pushed her too far. He came at Daniel with a knife, screaming incoherently. Daniel caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted hard. The snap of bone was audible even over the chaos outside. Carver screamed. Daniel punched him once in the face. Carver's head rocked back at an unnatural angle. His neck broke with a sound like a dry branch cracking. He was dead before he hit the floor. 3 overseers dead in under a minute. The twins looked at each other, breathing hard, covered in other men's blood. They felt nothing, no remorse, no guilt. These were the men who'd kept them in chains their entire lives, who'd whipped their mother and father and sister. This was justice, long overdue. They grabbed the weapons, 3 rifles, 2 pistols, ammunition, and ran outside into chaos. The plantation was burning. Multiple fires creating a hellscape of orange light and black smoke. People shouting, running. Bells ringing as someone tried to raise the alarm. The remaining 5 overseers were scrambling, trying to organize a response, trying to understand what was happening. They'd never prepared for this possibility. Slaves didn't rebel. Slaves didn't fight back. That's what they believed. That's what they'd been wrong about. Samuel and his team had hit the barn successfully. The building was fully engulfed, flames reaching 30 feet into the night sky. The heat was incredible even from 50 yards away. 3 horses trapped inside were screaming, horrible, inhuman sounds that Samuel knew would haunt him forever. But there was no time to save them, no time for mercy. They had to keep moving. The hardest target was the big house. That's where Richardson was, where his family was, where most of the guns were stored, where the real danger lay. Abini led the assault, her, Thomas and 4 other slaves armed with axes and righteous fury accumulated over lifetimes of suffering. They burst through the front door, a door slaves were never allowed to use, a threshold they'd never been permitted to cross. Abini had to duck to fit through even though it was built tall. For a moment, she stood in the foyer with its expensive chandelier and imported wallpaper. Stood in the house that represented 3 generations of wealth built on stolen lives and broken bodies. Richardson came down the stairs with a pistol in his shaking hand. Behind him, his wife and 2 children were screaming. The guests, a merchant from Savannah and his wife, were hiding somewhere upstairs. Richardson aimed the pistol at Abini with trembling hands. His face was red with fury and fear. "You goddamn..." Abini moved faster than he could track, 11 years of rage and humiliation compressed into one explosive moment. She covered the distance between them in 3 strides, grabbed his wrist before he could fire, twisted hard. The bones in his wrist ground together audibly. He screamed and dropped the gun. It clattered on the polished wood floor. Abini picked him up by the throat with one hand, lifted him completely off the floor. His feet kicked uselessly in the air. His hands clawed at her arm, leaving scratch marks that drew blood but accomplished nothing. For 11 years, she'd been his property. For 11 years, she'd bowed and submitted and hidden her strength. For 11 years, she'd pretended to be something less than human. Not anymore. She looked into Richardson's bulging eyes, made sure he saw her. Really saw the person he'd bought and tried to break. Saw the human being he'd treated as livestock. Saw the mother and wife and warrior he'd tried to destroy and failed. Then she threw him. Threw him with all the strength her massive frame possessed. He flew 15 feet across the foyer and crashed into the far wall. His head hit the expensive imported wallpaper with a wet crack. He slid down slowly, leaving a dark smear of blood. He wasn't dead. His chest still rose and fell, but he'd never walk right again. Never be whole again. Never forget what it felt like to be powerless. Thomas had run upstairs, found Richardson's study, found the maps he needed, maps showing roads north, locations of Union encampments, towns that might be sympathetic or hostile. He grabbed them, grabbed a compass from the desk, grabbed a bag of coins from the drawer. Supplies for their escape. Information that might keep them alive. Outside, the remaining overseers had organized slightly. Were firing rifles at the running slaves. One of the adult slaves who'd joined the conspiracy, a man named Jacob, took a bullet to the chest, dropped instantly, dead before he hit the ground. Another woman, Sarah, was shot in the leg, went down screaming. Joshua ran back for her through gunfire, picked her up like she weighed nothing, carried her while she bled and screamed and held on. Grace had taken a rifle from a dead overseer's hands. She'd never fired a gun before, but she'd watched them do it 1,000 times. She aimed at one of the remaining overseers, a man named Patterson, who'd whipped her mother 3 years ago, pulled the trigger. The recoil knocked her back a step. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt 5 feet from Patterson. He turned toward her with his own rifle. Daniel shot him first. Patterson's head snapped back. He dropped. The family met at the designated spot, the old oak tree at the north edge of the plantation. Samuel, Abini, Grace, Joshua, Daniel, Thomas, 6 adult slaves. Sarah with the bleeding leg wound. They'd lost Jacob, lost another man to a bullet. 11 survivors out of 13 who'd started this. Behind them, Riverside Plantation burned. The cotton storage was completely destroyed. The barn had collapsed into itself. The overseer quarters were engulfed. Parts of the big house were catching fire. 3 generations of accumulated wealth turning to smoke and ash and memory. They ran north, following the North Star that enslaved people had been following for generations, following Thomas's stolen maps, following desperate hope and the slim chance that they might actually make it. Behind them, horses, dogs, the pursuit organizing. But they had a head start. And they had something Richardson could never match: the absolute determination of people who'd chosen freedom over survival. Freedom. The pursuit lasted 3 days. Richardson, crippled but alive, organized a militia. 30 men on horses with rifles and hatred, but they were tracking giants. People who could run longer and faster than normal humans. The first day they covered 15 miles before stopping to rest. At dawn, the dogs caught up. 4 hounds bred for slave catching. The first leapt at Abini. She caught it mid-air, broke its neck with one twist, threw the corpse aside. The second went for Samuel. Daniel kicked it so hard it flew 10 feet and didn't get up. The other 2 fled. On the second day they lost Sarah. Her wound was infected. She was feverish, delirious. She told them to go on without her, that she'd rather die here than get everyone caught. They left her by a stream with what water they could spare. 7 left now. On the 3rd day they reached the Altamaha River, fast-flowing, deep. They had to swim. Grace and the twins were strong swimmers. Between them, they got everyone across. But one man, Moses, lost his grip, disappeared under the water. 6 left. But crossing bought them time. The militia had to backtrack miles to find a bridge. On the 4th day, exhausted and starving, they saw Union soldiers, blue uniforms, northern accents. Rifles pointed at them until an officer realized they were escaped slaves. Captain Morrison from Ohio listened to their story, looked at the family of giants with awe, looked at their wounds, their exhaustion, the desperate hope in their eyes. He made a decision that would change their lives forever. You're under Union protection now. By order of the United States Army, you're free. Grace fell to her knees and cried. The twins held each other and wept. Thomas experienced the freedom he'd only read about in stolen newspapers. Abini reclaimed what had been stolen 11 years ago. And Samuel, who'd been property his entire life, held his family and cried until he had no tears left. They were free. Epilogue. The Civil War ended 6 weeks later. Slavery was abolished throughout the United States. Richardson survived but never recovered. The plantation never recovered either. Richardson died bitter and broke in 1871, still cursing the slaves who'd destroyed him. The family settled in Ohio. Samuel worked as a carpenter. Abini worked in a factory where her strength was valued. The children grew up free. Grace reached 7 feet 1 inch, became a teacher, using her presence to protect black children. Joshua topped out at 7 feet 3, became a blacksmith. Daniel reached 7 feet, became a carpenter like his father. Thomas grew to 6 feet 11, became a lawyer, using words to fight injustice. They all married, had children born free. Grandchildren who couldn't imagine their ancestors had been property. Every March 15th until they died, the family gathered, told the story again, remembered Sarah and Moses and Jacob, remembered the night they chose freedom, and they taught their children what Abini had taught them, that those who grew tall had an obligation to stand against injustice, to never bow, to never accept that anyone could own another human being. Nobody believed it when they saw the children. But those impossible giants changed the world just by refusing to stay small, by refusing to accept that their strength existed to enrich masters, by remembering that power without conscience was slavery, but power with purpose was liberation. They were born into chains, but they died free, and that made all the difference.